Welcome back to Bad Things in History, where we don't spend the first few minutes stalling before getting to the topic you clicked on. This episode continues our series which explores the worst events of the 1920s. Today we focus on the year 1924. The period between World War I and the Great Depression is usually remembered as a peaceful time, but it was a chaotic decade full of horrible events and unsavory individuals. People died from mistakes, ignorance, and, of course, murder. Our first story describes how some unfortunate souls met their end in a watery grave. HMS L24. The British did a lot of work on submarines during the 1920s, and they lost several of them in the process. Earlier in the decade, the British Navy worked on improving their K-class submarines. These were built during World War I. That effort was unsuccessful, and one of the vessels was lost in 1921. At the end of the war, they built larger submarines. These were referred to as L-class and were quite large. These submarines were 230 feet long, 23 feet wide, and could dive to a depth of 150 feet. When on the surface, an L-class vessel was propelled by two 1,200 horsepower diesel engines. On January 10, 1924, the submarine designated as L-24 took part in an exercise off the English coast. Among the vessels participating was a battleship called Resolution. At 11:13 a.m., the crew of the Resolution felt as though the boat struck something. But they didn't find anything, and the battleship wasn't damaged. When Resolution returned to port, it was discovered that L-24 had not returned, and the hull of Resolution was slightly damaged. A later investigation discovered that HMS L24 had surfaced near the battleship. It tried to take evasive action, but it was too late. Resolution struck the submarine, which then sank to the bottom of the ocean. It is estimated that 38 people died in the accident. Castle Gate Mine Disaster. Coal mines were located all over the United States in the early 20th century. This also included Castle Gate, Utah, which is around 100 miles away from Salt Lake City. Coal mines are full of hazards. One of the deadly items miners have to deal with is coal dust. It can diffuse through the air within an active mine. If it is ignited, then it can explode. Miners were aware of this in the 1920s. Usually at the end of a working day, they would dampen coal dust within the mine. By keeping it wet, they could rest assured that the dust would not catch on fire. On March 8, 1924, a shift of workers in the Castle Gate mine didn't do this properly. Around 8 a.m., someone from the next shift was investigating a roof in the mine. His job was to try and discover things that might be dangerous, but as he was trying to examine the roof, his carbide lamp went out. He needed light to see, so he struck a match. When the match burst into flame, it lit coal dust that was suspended in the air. The result was a sudden and violent explosion. Equipment and telephone poles near the mine entrance were thrown almost 1 mile away. Not all the miners died, but they were trapped in the dark, and their lamps had gone out during the first explosion. To help see what was happening, they tried to light their lamps. This triggered another explosion. This explosion in turn caused the mine to collapse and killed all the miners. It took 9 days to recover the bodies. Many of them were so disfigured that they could only be identified by articles of clothing. A total of 171 miners died in the accident. Leopold and Loeb. Sometimes people who think they are very smart really aren't. Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb were from Chicago. They came from wealthy families and lived in an affluent area of the city. The two were aware of each other while growing up, but when they attended college, the pair began spending more time with each other. The two began reading the works of Friedrich Nietzsche and became obsessed with his description of Superman. These individuals were described as more intelligent and capable than most people, and they were immune to the consequences of their actions. Nathan and Richard decided that this description applied to them. They began testing this theory by committing crimes. They broke into buildings and stole things. Nathan and Richard vandalized property all over the city. They even set things on fire. Nobody even suspected them of being criminals. The two became frustrated as the press wasn't covering their mischievous deeds. So they decided it was time to commit the perfect crime. Kidnapping and murder would be the way in which they proved their superiority. They spent 7 months planning the crime. On the afternoon of May 21st, 1924, Nathan and Richard began executing their plan. They settled on victimizing 14-year-old Robert Franks. He was Richard's second cousin and belonged to a wealthy family. They rented a car, then drove it alongside Robert. They offered him a ride, and Robert climbed into the car. Nathan was driving. Robert was in the passenger seat. Richard was behind Robert. As they drove, Richard took a chisel and hit Robert in the head repeatedly. Then he was dragged into the back seat and gagged. Robert died soon after. Nathan and Richard left the body in a ditch and poured acid on it. Then the two killers went home and called Robert's family, demanding a ransom. They also sent a ransom note. Before the pair could collect their blood money, Robert's body was found. Police also found a pair of prescription glasses at the crime scene. It turned out they belonged to Nathan. Robert's murder was not the perfect crime. Nathan and Richard were arrested and put on trial. At the time, it was called the Trial of the Century. They were found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. In 1936, Richard was killed in prison. An inmate fatally wounded him with a straight razor. Nathan remained incarcerated until 1958. He died of a heart attack in 1971. Napalpi Massacre. Indigenous people have suffered all over the world. In the 1920s, the native inhabitants of Argentina were the next to endure violence and death. The Toba people inhabited what is today northern Argentina. The arrival of Europeans reduced their territory as they were attacked and defeated repeatedly. In the 1880s, the Toba no longer had the numbers or resources to resist the invaders, so they retreated to a heavily forested part of northern Argentina. They survived in this difficult terrain for years. But little by little their land was taken and their population was reduced. The Toba people were placed into camps and began working on farms. It was demanding work, but some of the natives actually began earning a profit. Soon they would face the possibility of extinction one more time. The Argentine government began taxing cotton at a rate of 15%. The Toba were not happy and began revolting. They retaliated against some of the European farmers and killed their animals. A couple of settlers were killed as well. The governor of the region decided to use overwhelming force to resolve the situation. On July 19, 1924, a group of police, ranchers, and white citizens armed themselves. The group of 150 men began marching on the Napalpi community. It took them 40 minutes to finish attacking the group. The militant group shot over 5,000 rounds during the attack. When it was finished, they used machetes to kill the survivors. Then trophies were taken. The attackers cut parts off the bodies of the dead and displayed them proudly in their homes and businesses. The death toll was around 200 men, women, and children. Some white farmers that wanted to help the Toba were also killed in the massacre. Nobody was ever punished for this crime. Babbs switch fire. In the early 20th century, rural children who attended school in the United States often did so in what was known as a one-room schoolhouse. Instead of being segregated based on age, all the pupils were present in a single large room. This was a convenient arrangement for educators, but on Christmas Eve 1924, it would become a dangerous situation for one school in Babbs Switch, Oklahoma. The school decided to have a party on the day before Christmas. At least 200 people were packed into the small building. At the front of the room was a large Christmas tree. Instead of electric lights, it was covered with candles. There were wrapped presents in the branches of the tree as well. A teenage student arrived dressed as Santa Claus. He began taking presents from the tree and handing them to children, but as he removed one of the presents, the wrapping paper was ignited by a candle. The presents and the tree burst into flames. Soon it began spreading to the entire building. Everyone tried to leave the building, but there was only one door that opened inward. So as people pushed against the door, it became impossible to open it. The windows also had metal screens to prevent entry into the school, so nobody could use windows to escape the flames either. One child managed to climb out a window. Everyone else remained trapped until rescuers could get into the building. In the end, 36 of the occupants died. At least 30 more were seriously injured. The remaining survivors would never forget the horrible experience. As a result of the disaster, fire safety codes were improved in Oklahoma and eventually the rest of the country as well. Battle of Hanapepe. In the 1920s, one of the main exports from Hawaii was sugarcane. There were several plantations that produced the crop. The most profitable of these were near the community of Hanapepe. The plantation depended almost entirely on laborers from the Philippines. By the early 1920s, the plantation owners were becoming disillusioned with the Filipino workers. They began demanding better conditions, which cut into the profit margins. The crop producers in Hawaii wanted to use cheap Chinese labor instead. But the Chinese Exclusion Act prevented that, so they had to keep using Filipinos. If you want to know more about why Chinese were banned from the United States, we discuss it in another episode called Rock Springs Massacre. In 1924, the laborers finally had enough. They demanded an increase in the minimum wage, and they wanted the workday reduced to just 8 hours. The plantation owners ignored the workers' demands. Having exhausted all other options, the Filipino laborers finally went on strike. Those who led the strike found that they became inviting targets. Individuals hired by the planters would sabotage their efforts to organize. Others were paid to testify against strikers in court. On September 9th, the Filipino strikers lost their patience. They kidnapped 2 people who tried to break the strike and return to work. The police arrived and tried to rescue the kidnapped workers. They faced 200 angry Filipinos. The laborers were armed with knives, clubs, and pistols. The police and the striking workers began fighting each other. Eventually, the authorities gained the upper hand and the opponents fled. 16 Filipino strikers were killed, as were 2 police officers. The police began searching for those who participated in the attack. Over 100 were arrested, though only 76 faced charges. At least 56 of the workers ended up receiving 4-year prison sentences. The Filipino labor movement did not completely disappear, but it never had much success. As the 1920s began, natural disasters, accidents, and assassinations seemed to indicate a possible trend, but by the middle of the decade, people were tired of pleasantries. A lot of them apparently had murder on their minds. What do you think about the events of this terrible year? Was the past much like today? Or are you suddenly glad to live in the present? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Also, like the video and subscribe to our channel if you feel like helping us out. We have a Patreon page and merchandise on our website. Links are in the video description below. Thank you for watching Bad Things in History.